Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Yeah.
You guys sent us so much stuff, and we're really going to try to unpack it all today. It paints a pretty bleak picture, honestly.
Hmm.
But the good news is we're here together to try to make sense of it all.
Absolutely. And we're gonna try to shine a light on some of the connections and patterns that we're seeing.
Yeah, and especially, how the actions of this current U.S. administration
Hmm.
are really shaking things up and not in a good way. So we want to kind of dive into that.
Yeah, no, it's really remarkable the level of disruption and destabilization that we're seeing emanate from Washington.
Yeah, it's like a global dumpster fire.
Yeah.
And, the people that are supposed to be putting it out are just like pouring gasoline on it instead.
Well, that's one way to put it. I think, what we're seeing is really a deliberate effort to undermine the institutions and norms that have governed the global order for decades.
Yeah, it's not just incompetence. It's something much more calculated and honestly sinister.
Agreed. And I think, we really need to call it what it is. This is an assault on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law.
Absolutely. So let's start with the situation in Ukraine. I mean,
Right.
it's bad, but the depth of this administration's recklessness is truly alarming.
What's happening in Ukraine goes beyond mere incompetence. This is a deliberate undermining of democratic values and global stability. This whole Zelensky-Trump clash, it's a textbook example of how not to handle international
It's
relations.
more like a reality TV showdown than statesmanship.
Absolutely.
The blatant disrespect from Trump towards Zelensky, a wartime leader, is appalling. But it's not just the optics. The consequences are dire. I mean, Trump halting military aid and intelligence, that's not just a policy shift, it's a betrayal.
It's a betrayal of our allies. It's a betrayal of democratic values. And frankly, it's a betrayal of the American people.
And you know who benefits from all of this? Russia. Look no further than Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president, who's practically salivating at the chance to inflict maximum damage on Ukraine.
Right. It's as if this administration is deliberately trying to hand Ukraine over to Russia on a silver platter. They're emboldening Putin and giving him a free pass to expand his sphere of influence.
It's like handing a loaded gun to a bully.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen this pattern before, right, with this administration. They appease dictators and strongmen while alienating our allies.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the rumors about Trump's team cozying up to Ukrainian opposition figures. It reeks of trying to install a puppet regime, one more sympathetic to Trump's personal agenda than the needs of the Ukrainian people.
And then you have Steve Bannon calling Zelensky a crook and a punk senator, Lindsey Graham demanding his resignation. This is beyond diplomatic discord. It's a full-on smear campaign.
It's designed to discredit Zelensky's so chaos and make it easier for Russia to swoop in.
And amid all of this manufactured chaos, what about the Ukrainian people? They're caught in the middle of all of this. They're exhausted from years of conflict and desperate for a peaceful resolution. But with the U.S. withdrawing support and Russia emboldened, finding a path to peace seems nearly impossible.
And that's precisely what this administration wants. Chaos and instability create opportunities for them to exploit, to further their own agenda at the expense of global security and human rights.
It's like they're playing a dangerous game of chess, using Ukraine as a pawn with no regard for the human cost.
And unfortunately, Ukraine is just one piece on the global chessboard. We're seeing similar patterns of disruption and destabilization playing out all over the world.
Yeah, it's like they're actively dismantling the international order that's kept the peace for decades, replacing it with a chaotic and unpredictable world where might makes right. And it's not just Ukraine. The repercussions of this administration's actions are being felt across Europe. They're scrambling to fill the void left by the U.S., holding emergency summits, and desperately trying to figure out how to defend themselves.
It's a wake-up call for Europe and a stark reminder that they can no longer rely on the U.S. for their security. Ursula von der Leyen's Rearm Europe plan, with its ambitious €800 billion defense spending goal, is a clear sign of this shift.
But throwing money at the problem isn't going to be enough. It takes years to build up a credible defense force, and in the meantime, Europe is vulnerable.
And what message does this send to the world? That the U.S. is no longer a reliable partner, that we're retreating from our global leadership role. This has profound implications for the future of democracy and the rules-based international order.
Yeah, it's a bleak prospect, and one that could have been avoided if the U.S. had maintained its commitment to international cooperation and diplomacy. But instead, this administration has chosen to go it alone, pursuing a narrow, self-serving agenda that has alienated allies and emboldened adversaries.
It's a dangerous and short-sighted approach, one that is already having a profound impact on the global landscape.
And who suffers the most in all of this? It's not the powerful or the wealthy. It's the vulnerable, the marginalized, the very people who need international cooperation and solidarity the most.
The rise of nationalism, xenophobia, and authoritarianism that we're seeing globally is a direct result of this administration's policies. They've created a climate of fear and division, undermining the values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law.
It's like they're tearing down the very fabric of our society, replacing it with something brittle and dangerous and, frankly, unsustainable.
And it's not just happening overseas. We're seeing these same forces at play right here in the United States. The erosion of democratic norms, the attacks on the free press, the rise of political violence. These are all warning signs that we cannot ignore.
It's a wake-up call for all of us, a reminder that we cannot take our democracy for granted. We need to be vigilant in defending our rights and freedoms and holding our leaders accountable.
Absolutely. The stakes are too high to remain silent or complacent. The future of our country and our world depends on it.
Well said. So let's move on to how this administration's actions are emboldening autocrats and undermining democracy around the world. And believe me, the examples are plentiful and deeply disturbing.
What's perhaps most alarming is how this administration's disdain for democratic norms is becoming a blueprint for aspiring autocrats. They see the U.S., once a beacon of democracy, retreating from its role as a global leader, and they're seizing the opportunity to fill the void.
It's like watching a virus spread as authoritarianism gains a foothold in countries that were once on the path to greater freedom and democracy. And it's not just happening in far-flung corners of the world. It's happening right here in our own hemisphere, in countries that were once close allies of the U.S.
The erosion of democratic institutions, the suppression of dissent, the concentration of power in the hands of a few, these are all warning signs that should alarm anyone who values freedom and human rights. And make no mistake, this trend is a direct consequence of this administration's policies.
By weakening international institutions, cozying up to dictators, and turning a blind eye to human rights abuses, they've created a permissive environment for authoritarianism to flourish.
And they've done so while simultaneously attacking democracy at home, undermining the rule of law, and eroding public trust in our institutions.
It's a dangerous and cynical game they're playing, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
The future of democracy itself is at stake.
And let's not forget the impact on the global economy. This administration's trade wars, tariffs, and protectionist policies have thrown the global market into turmoil, creating uncertainty, instability, and hardship for people around the world.
Their policies have disproportionately impacted developing countries, exacerbating poverty and inequality, and undermining efforts to create a more just and equitable global economic system.
It's a recipe for disaster, and the consequences are already being felt.
We're seeing a rise in global poverty, a decline in global trade, and a growing sense of economic anxiety and insecurity.
And it's only going to get worse if this administration continues down this destructive path.
We need a fundamentally different approach to global economics, one that prioritizes fairness, sustainability, and cooperation over greed, exploitation, and competition.
We need an economic system that works for everyone, not just the wealthy and powerful.
Absolutely. And we need to start by rejecting the failed policies of this administration and embracing a progressive vision for a more just and equitable world.
Well said. We'll delve deeper into that vision in part 2 of our deep dive. But for now, let's take a quick break.
Sounds good. Welcome back to our deep dive. You know, last time we really kind of laid bare the damage this administration is inflicting, not just within the U.S., but really on a global scale.
Yeah, and honestly, it's enough to make even the most optimistic person just want to crawl into bed and pull the covers over their head.
Yeah.
But, we can't give in to despair. That's exactly what they want. They want us to give up, to accept this, grim reality they've manufactured.
Right. They thrive on our apathy, on our sense of helplessness. Because when we disengage, they win.
So what can we do? How do we even begin to counter this massive, machine of, destruction and chaos?
Well, first, we need to understand that they're not just incompetent. They're exploiting the very systems that are meant to safeguard us.
You're saying this is deliberate, this is by design.
Absolutely. Take their trade wars, for example. They claim it's about protecting American jobs, but in reality, it's about dismantling the global order and replacing it with something far more sinister.
So it's not just about economics, it's about power. It's about control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're trying to create a world where might makes right, where international cooperation is replaced with cutthroat competition, and where the U.S. dictates terms to everyone else.
So it's like a global game of King of the Hill, and they're determined to be on top no matter the cost.
And the irony is their actions are actually backfiring. They're strengthening opposition both at home and abroad.
So you're saying there's a silver lining to all of this?
Absolutely. This administration's blatant disregard for democratic norms and human rights has awakened a global resistance, a coalition of the willing who are determined to defend the values of a just and equitable world.
So it's like a global immune response. The body is fighting back against the virus.
Precisely. And this resistance is taking many forms. From the streets of major cities to the halls of international institutions, people are rising up demanding change and rejecting this administration's toxic agenda.
And that's where the progressive movement comes in, right? It's not just about opposing their policies. It's about offering a viable alternative, a roadmap for a better future.
Exactly. The progressive agenda is about building a world that is rooted in fairness, compassion, sustainability, and cooperation. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that our fates are intertwined, and that we have a shared responsibility to create a better world for all.
It's about reclaiming the promise of a just and equitable society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, where our planet is protected, and where peace and dignity prevail.
And it's gaining traction. People are waking up to the fact that the old ways of doing things are no longer working. They're realizing that the current system is rigged against them, that it benefits the wealthy and powerful at the expense of the many, and they're demanding change.
So what you're saying is there's hope?
There's always hope. But hope is not a passive emotion. It's a call to action. It's a demand for change. It's a refusal to accept the status quo.
So what can we do? Where do we go from here?
Well, first, we need to educate ourselves. We need to understand the issues, the stakes, and the solutions. We need to be informed and engaged citizens.
And then we need to take action.
Yeah.
We need to get involved in our communities. We need to support progressive candidates and organizations. We need to make our voices heard.
Exactly. We need to vote. We need to protest. We need to organize. We need to hold our leaders accountable. And we need to never give up hope.
Because the future is not yet written. We have the power to shape it. We have the power to create the world we want to live in.
A world where justice prevails, where equality reigns, and where the planet and its people thrive.
And that's a world worth fighting for.
Absolutely.
So let's keep fighting.
Let's do it.
Now let's turn our attention to a particularly alarming trend that's been exacerbated by this administration's actions: the rise of disinformation and the erosion of truth. In an era of social media and 247 news cycles, information spreads at lightning speed, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to discern fact from fiction.
And this administration has weaponized disinformation, using it to sow division, undermine trust in institutions, and advance their own narrow agenda. They've lied, cheated, and manipulated the truth, with impunity eroding public faith in the very foundations of our democracy.
It's like we're living in a post-truth world where facts no longer matter, and where those in power can say and do whatever they please without consequence.
And the consequences have been devastating. We've seen a rise in political polarization, a decline in civic engagement, and a growing sense of cynicism and distrust.
It's like they're deliberately trying to break down our ability to think critically, to discern truth from falsehood, to engage in meaningful dialogue.
Exactly. They want us to be passive consumers of information, to accept their version of reality without question.
But we can't let them win. We need to fight back against disinformation. We need to reclaim the value of truth.
Absolutely. We need to be critical thinkers. We need to question the information we consume. We need to demand evidence. We need to support independent journalism. And we need to hold those who spread disinformation accountable.
We need to be the guardians of truth.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And we need to start right now. The future of our democracy depends on it.
And that brings us to the issue of voting rights, an area where this administration has actively sought to suppress the vote, particularly among marginalized communities.
Their actions, from supporting voter ID laws to purging voter rolls to closing polling places in minority neighborhoods, have been a blatant attempt to undermine the very foundation of our democracy, the right to vote.
These efforts to suppress the vote are a direct attack on our democracy, and they must be met with fierce resistance.
The right to vote is sacred, and it must be protected at all costs. We need to make our voices heard at the ballot box, and we need to fight to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to participate in our democracy.
And we need to call out these voter suppression tactics for what they are: a cynical attempt to cling to power by silencing the voices of those who threaten their grip on it.
Absolutely. We cannot let them get away with it. The future of our democracy is at stake.
Now let's shift gears and examine how this administration's policies have exacerbated economic inequality, creating a system that benefits the wealthy and powerful at the expense of the working class and the poor.
Their actions, from tax cuts for the wealthy to deregulation of Wall Street to attacks on labor unions, have rigged the game in favor of the already privileged, leaving millions of Americans struggling to make ends meet.
The gap between the rich and the poor has widened dramatically under this administration, reaching levels not seen since the Great Depression. and the consequences have been devastating.
We've seen a rise in poverty, homelessness, and hunger as millions of Americans struggle to afford basic necessities. We've seen a decline in social mobility as the American dream of upward mobility has become increasingly out of reach for many. And we've seen an erosion of the middle class, the backbone of our economy and our society.
It's like they've declared war on the working class, deliberately dismantling the very structures that provide stability and opportunity.
And they've done it under the guise of economic growth and prosperity, but the reality is that their policies have only benefited the wealthiest few while leaving everyone else behind.
This economic inequality is not just a moral failing, it's a threat to our democracy and our economy. When so much wealth is concentrated in the hands of so few, it undermines our political system, distorts our economy, and erodes social cohesion.
It creates a system where the wealthy have an outsized influence on our government and our economy, while the needs of the majority are ignored.
It's time to reject this trickle-down economics and demand an economy that works for everyone, not just the wealthy few.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
We need to fight for policies that promote economic fairness and opportunity. We need to raise the minimum wage, invest in education and job training, strengthen unions, and create an economy that works for all Americans.
We need to build an economy that is just sustainable and equitable one where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
And that's what the progressive agenda is all about. It's about creating a world where everyone has a fair shot, where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential, and where everyone has a voice in the decisions that affect their lives.
And that's a world worth fighting for.
Absolutely.
So let's keep fighting.
Let's do it.
All right, welcome back. So if you've been with us through parts 1 and 2, we haven't exactly been painting a rosy picture.
Not exactly a trip to Disneyland.
All right. This administration's actions are causing such immense harm, both at home and abroad, and it's easy to feel just overwhelmed, even paralyzed by the sheer scale of it all.
Absolutely. But despair is a luxury we can't afford right now. What we've done so far, understanding the problems, connecting the dots, that's crucial. But now we need to shift from analysis to action.
Okay, so where do we even begin? The progressive agenda seems so vast, almost too big to grasp when we're facing such entrenched power.
Well, that's where strategic thinking comes in. The progressive agenda isn't some monolithic thing. It's a framework with multiple entry points.
Okay, I like that. So kind of break it down for us.
Think of it like a massive tree. The trunk is our shared values, justice, equality, sustainability. But the branches are the specific issues where we can apply pressure, make change.
Okay, so let's talk branches. What are some concrete actions that our listeners can take starting right now to counter what we've been discussing?
First, ditch the lone wolf mentality. This administration thrives on isolating us, making us feel powerless. But collective action, that's the antidote.
Right, strength in numbers.
Exactly. Join organizations aligned with your passions, climate justice, healthcare advocacy, whatever burns brightest for you.
I mean, there's so many amazing organizations out there doing incredible work.
And they need our support. They need our energy. They need our voices.
And these groups provide resources, strategies.
Yeah.
They've been fighting this fight for a long time. They know what they're doing.
Precisely. So plug in, find your tribe, and get to work.
Okay, so join forces. What else?
Become a relentless information sharer.
Okay, so you're talking about, like sharing articles on social media and stuff.
Not just mindless rants. I'm talking about informed, targeted engagement.
So be strategic about it.
Exactly. Share articles from reputable sources that debunk the administration's lies, that highlight the real-world impact of their policies.
So that study we mentioned earlier about how this administration's environmental rollbacks are directly linked to increased respiratory illnesses in vulnerable communities. Hit them with the facts, the human stories, the things that cut through the noise.
Precisely. Because remember, they thrive on confusion, on misinformation. We need to be the antidote to that.
Okay, so we got to fight fire with facts.
What else?
Don't underestimate the power of personal storytelling.
Oh, I like that. Tell your story.
Exactly. Have you been personally affected by this administration's actions?
Yeah, I think we all have in some way or another.
Share your experience with friends, family, even elected officials. Personal stories make the abstract concrete, the political personal.
It's like that saying, statistics are people with the tears wiped away. Bring back the human element. That's powerful.
And it's something we can all do. Okay, so share your story. What about at the local level? It can feel like national politics is this giant machine that we can't touch.
That's where they want us to think. But local elections, school boards, city councils, these are the battlegrounds where progressive values can take root and grow.
So you're saying think globally, act locally.
Exactly. Volunteer for candidates who champion those values, organize phone banks, get your hands dirty in the nitty-gritty of local politics.
Because change doesn't just magically happen at the top.
Right.
It starts from the ground up, from those small, seemingly insignificant actions that ripple outwards.
Exactly. So don't underestimate the power of your local community to make a difference.
Okay, so get involved locally. What else?
Never underestimate the power of the purse.
Okay, now you're speaking my language.
Support businesses that align with progressive values, those committed to fair labor practices, sustainability, ethical sourcing. Boycott those that don't. Every dollar you spend is a vote for the kind of world you want to live in.
Hit them where it hurts, the bottom line. Makes perfect sense.
It's about aligning our values with our actions, putting our money where our mouth is.
So be conscious consumers.
Hmm.
What about those of us who are already burnt out?
Mm-hmm.
We've been marching, donating, calling our reps to our horse. It can feel like we're pushing a boulder uphill.
Self-care isn't selfish, it's strategic.
I love that.
You can't pour from an empty cup.
So true.
Take breaks, recharge, reconnect with the things that bring you joy. This fight is a marathon, not a sprint.
We need to pace ourselves, stay fueled, and keep our eyes on the long game.
Absolutely. And remember, progress isn't always linear. There will be setbacks, disappointments, moments that make you question everything.
Oh yeah, I've definitely had those moments.
But those moments are inevitable. They don't mean defeat. They mean we're on the right track, pushing against a system that's desperate to hold on to power.
So embrace the discomfort, the messiness of it all, because that's where growth happens. That's where real change is forged.
Precisely. And celebrate the small victories along the way. A local ordinance passed a company adopting ethical practices. These are signs that the tide is turning.
It's about shifting our perspective, right?
Yeah.
Not focusing solely on what we haven't achieved, but recognizing how far we've come, how much ground we've gained.
Exactly. And never underestimate the power of hope. Hope is not naive optimism. It's a defiant act, a refusal to accept the darkness as inevitable. It's the fuel that keeps us going, that inspires us to keep fighting, even when the odds seem stacked against us.
Because if we lose hope, we lose everything. And that's exactly what this administration is banking on.
So let's defy their expectations. Let's channel our anger, our frustration, our grief into action. Let's join forces, raise our voices, and fight for the world we want to live in. A world where justice prevails, where equality reigns, and where the planet and its people thrive.
A world where everyone has a chance to not just survive, but to truly thrive.
Exactly. A world where we prioritize people and planet over profit and power.
That's a future worth fighting for.
Absolutely.
And on that note, we conclude this deep dive. It's been heavy, it's been challenging, but it's also been incredibly inspiring.
We've explored the dark underbelly of this administration's actions, but we've also illuminated the path forward, the path towards a brighter, more just and equitable future.
And that path is paved with a progressive agenda. It's a vision that is rooted in hope, in the belief that we can do better, that we must do better.
And that's a vision worth fighting for.
Absolutely. So let's get to work.
Let's do it.
Thanks for joining us.